Herzlich willkommen, guten Morgen an alle. Ich mache es ganz kurz. Wir hören jetzt gleich den Festvortrag von unserem Medaillenträger Mario Vargas Llosa. Senor, the floor is yours. May I ask you?
Ladies and gentlemen, dear friends, let me first to thank the Friedrich Hayek Society for honoring me with this medal. Believe it or not, when I received the letter telling me about this medal and about the Hayek Society, I was writing a little essay on Hayek. That was a miraculous coincidence. I met Professor Hayek in the late 70s in Lima when he went there for an economic conference. And I was deeply impressed by his ideas, his energy, the way in which he expressed his conviction about the liberal doctrine, about liberalism. And I hadn't read him yet, and I started to read him. And I remember the first book that I read of him, The Road to Serfdom, produced an enormous impression on myself. Since then, I have been reading him, studying him, and I think history, contemporary history, has been proving the realism and also the certitude of his prognostics and his ideas for a modern and a free society. As this award has been given to me, I suppose, not for literary reasons, but much more for civic and political reasons, I am planning today to tell you in a very synthetic way, more or less, how I became a liberal, which I think is what I am or am trying to do, a liberal. I was very young when I discovered the social problem. I was still at the school. I had 14, 15 years old. And I discovered that my country, Peru, was a country dramatically divided between rich, which were very few, and poor, which was the great majority of Peruvians, and that these differences were based in exploitation, discrimination, and of course, as a young man and as an adolescent, I was deeply furious and enraged with this social situation. We had at that time a dictatorship, which was quite current in Latin America, a military dictatorship that we call el ocheño because it lasted 8 years, from 1948 until 1956. So my generation lived in Peru under a military dictatorship since we were children until we become men. I read a book. I was a voracious reader since my youth, you know, and I read a book at that time, which was very important in my adolescence. The Spanish title was La Noche Quedó Atrás, and the author was a German writer who used not his name, but a French pseudonymous, Jean Valjean. He had been a German communist during the Nazi period. I read this book as an adventure novel, you know, and it was very, very impressive, the way so courageous in which this man, totally convinced with socialist ideas, fought against Nazism, fascism, the Communist Party. He was a member, of course, of the Communist Party, was underground and victim of a brutal and systematic repression. But, and it was reading this book that I had an idea of communism as something extremely generous, idealistic, something that was fighting against all the evils that I had discovered in my country, exploitation of the poor, brutality, the brutality that the dictatorship was practicing every day in very different forms and manifestations in Peru. And although Jean Valjean, the author of this autobiography, at the end had kind of dissidence, when I finished the book, I was totally convinced that I should be a communist and that the communism was the best way, the shortest way to reach real freedom, social justice. And so I decided to go to the University of San Marcos. At that time in Peru there were two universities, the Catholic University and San Marcos, one of the oldest universities in Latin America. Peruvians believe that this is the oldest. Dominicans and Mexicans believe that their universities were the oldest, but it doesn't matter. It was a very old, it was founded at the beginning of the colonization. And San Marcos had a tradition of being a very popular institution and also a rebellious institution. It was, on the other hand, the university of the poor people. The Catholic University was for middle-class people, a social, let's say, upgrade, you know, the students. And so I decided to go to San Marcos. And it was because this tradition of anti-conformism, and also because I thought that in San Marcos probably I'll be able to reach the communists, my heroes at that time. All the political parties were outlawed by the dictatorship. There was no politics in the country. Politics was a dirty word. We had a law that had eliminated political parties in Peruvian life. Censorship, of course, was very, very strong with newspapers, with magazines, and with the radios. There was no television at that time in Peru. So when I entered the university, I entered to an institution that was impregnated with repression. The year before, 1952, it had been a strike, a political strike against the government, and the university has been brutally repressed because of that. So there were many teachers and students, particularly leaders of the students, who were or in prison or in exile, and everything was extremely suspicious in the university because the dictatorship had put, as students, policemen who were there to spy, and to discover dissidents and criticism of the government. But anyway, in spite of that, I made contact with the communists. The Communist Party, which was very small, was trying to resuscitate after this repression, and had taken the name of Inca hero, el Grupo Cahuide, and it was called El Grupo Cahuide, the future Communist Party of Peru. And so I entered the communist, and for 1 year I was a communist militant in the underground Grupo Cahuide. We were not very effective fighting against the dictatorship. I think the only achievement that we had in this year in which I was a communist was that we joined a strike of the workers of the tramway company in Lima. And I think this is the only practical thing that we did. But we studied a lot. We studied Marxism, which was, of course, forbidden in the university, in the underground circles of the party. And it was there that I had all the time disagreements with my comrades. Those were the worst years of the Stalinism. Stalinism was very, very strong, particularly in the domain of ideas, of convictions, of programs, and it was very difficult for me to become, a disciplined and orthodox Marxist, because of the books that I read, which were no communist. Those were the years in which French existentialism was very influential all over the world. Sartre, Camus, Simone de Beauvoir, Maurice Merleau-Ponty, and included the Catholic existentialist philosopher Gabriel Marcel, were very popular. And particularly myself, I was really a very enthusiastic follower, particularly of Sartre. I remember that when the great debate between Sartre and Camus about the concentration camp in the Soviet Union, I took immediately the side of Sartre, and I even wrote for a little magazine that we published in the university an article against Camus. But in the Communist Party, I had permanent disagreements with my comrades, and particularly in literature. I remember that it was an obligation for us to read Soviet writers, and I remember particularly one novel that I don't know why it was a must for us to read, Nikolai Ostrowski, Así se templó el acero. I don't know the English title of the book. I hated the book. I found it so boring, and I remember a discussion in my circle about Nicholas Ostrowski. And I said what was my impression. I said, it's horrendous, it's absolutely totally artificial, I don't believe a word, characters are not real people, they are just instruments of propaganda. I prefer JIT. JIT at that time was completely denigrated, by the communists, because the book that he has written after his return from the Soviet Union, and this made a dissident of myself. A few weeks or months after I resigned, completely disappointed and frustrated with this dogmatic and sectarian ideological vision of the communists. I became free, but I still a leftist, and even very, very leftist. And why? Because of Cuba. Because for me, what was happening in Cuba, the Castroist movement, the 26th of July movement, was still fighting against Batista, against the brutal dictatorship of Batista in Cuba, in the mountains. And this for me represented something that was much, much more important than the dogmatism of the Communist Party, of the communist parties of Latin America, because all were very, very Stalinistic in their ideology and their doctrine. And then the Cuban Revolution came, and for several years, the Cuban Revolution represented something extremely important for my generation and even other generations. With the perspective and with the transformation of Cuba in what is today, is difficult to understand, probably for most of you, the importance that the Cuban Revolution had all over Latin America and particularly in my generation. It seemed to us that the Cuban Revolution was materializing something that we were looking for since many, many years ago: socialism and freedom. Socialism that couldn't come through the Communist Party, but through socialists which were not so enslaved by Stalinism and by the Soviet Union model, a socialism that would be more open, more diverse, that would admit diversity, criticism, free press, free culture. That was the idea that the Cuban Revolution exported, particularly during the first years, that is, during the 60s. I went to Cuba for the first time in 1962. At that time, I was working in France as a journalist in the French radio television, and then they had sent me to Mexico to cover a very important French exhibition there. And suddenly, the crisis of October, you remember in 1962, when Nikita Khrushchev sent secretly, atomic weapons to Cuba, and Kennedy stopped this Soviet ship. Well, it was a very, very serious crisis. So the French radio television sent me to Cuba, and I went to Cuba, and I was 1 week or 10 days, and I was so impressed, so impressed with this mobilization of the Cuban people to resist the American invasion that seemed imminent, I always remember Cuba, the first time I went, when I read what George Orwell wrote about Spain when he went as a voluntary to fight for the Republic, and he arrived in Barcelona, and he said, for the first time in my life, words like fraternity, brotherhood, real freedom, hope for the future seemed to me real. That was the impression that I had during those days in my first visit to Cuba. And I became, of course, a militant supporter of the Cuban Revolution. I was invited to form part of a committee, an international committee of writers for the Casa de las Americas, a cultural institution in Cuba. And during the 60s, I went to Cuba 5 or 6 times for meetings of this committee, and so I could follow very closely the evolution of the Cuba Revolution. And well, I must synthesize a lot, and this constant traveling to Cuba meant for me a progressive disillusion. The idea that what we had thought of the Cuban Revolution was actually not confirmed by reality. In several cases, there was a total contradiction between the facts and the myths and the legends. But I remember particularly one episode which was for me very, how can I say, illuminating. It was when the Cuban government created the UMAPs. The UMAPs was an euphemism for Unidades Motorizables de Ayuda a la Producción, an institution to help production. Actually, it was a total euphemism because the UMAPs were concentration camps in which they were mixed counter-revolutionaries, the gusanos, criminals, common criminals, all kind of dissidents, and homosexuals. And I was particularly well informed what was happening in the UMAPs by it was literary and artistic group of young Cubans called El Puente, the bridge. The leader was a poet, José Mario, and I had met them because a Peruvian poet was part of the group, and they were young men, young women, poets, artists, novelists, painters, musicians, who were deeply committed for the revolution. They wanted the revolution to succeed. And they had the idea that was largely shared at the beginning of the revolution, that the revolution would mean not only social justice for workers, for peasants, but also for the sexual minorities, that sexual minorities would find at last understanding, and freedom to live without being harassed and discriminated. Well, the creation of the maps was a tragic reality for particularly the members of El Puente, of the bridge. Many of them were sent to these concentration camps with criminals and with the counter-revolutionaries. There were some suicides among them. And this was the first time that I manifested in an express way my criticism of the revolution. I sent a personal letter to Fidel Castro, saying, well, I am totally surprised. I don't understand. For me, Cuba was exactly the opposite. How is possible young writers, young artists who are so committed to the revolution to be put in concentration camps with criminals, with common criminals? And And I was invited to participate in a dialogue with Fidel Castro, with other writers who, I suppose, had written letters or expressed some kind of criticism because of what was happening. And it's the only time in my life that I talk is difficult to say, but we were in a small group, and we were with Fidel Castro from 8 in the evening until 8 in the morning, 12 hours. And I think he talked all the time. We could put, with great difficulty, some questions, some very short questions, but it was a monologue, a fascinating monologue, by the way. It was very charismatic, and he talked about the Sierra Maestra adventures, and he was, from time to time, guessing where will be Che Guevara, because he had disappeared. We didn't know where he was. He was in Bolivia already. And he said little things that were like puzzles, you know. He may be in South America, he may be in Central America. And it was very difficult to talk about the maps. But finally, he said a few words about that. He said, well, it's a pity. It's true that there were some injustices, but you must understand, all the young boys from peasant families who came to study in La Habana and were abused, you know, by the enfermitos. He called enfermitos injured people, you know, to homosexuals. But he said all the injustices will be corrected, you know. Well, I was very impressed, but I was not convinced. And since then I became, first secretly, after openly, a critic and a dissident also of the Cuban Revolution. My definite clash with the Cuban Revolution came when the Eberto Padilla case. Maybe you remember, some of you remember but Eberto Padilla was a poet, a very good Cuban poet, so committed to the revolution that he decided to stop writing poetry, literature, to work for the revolution. And he became vice minister of something, exterior commerce, I don't know. But he worked so hard, day and night for the revolution. And a few years after, one day he started to criticize not the revolution, but the cultural policies of the revolution in a Cuban magazine. And suddenly this, let's say, very moderate criticism were fiercely attacked by the magazine of the army, and suddenly he became the object of a ferocious criticism, accusing him of treason to the revolution, and all his friends were completely surprised, because we knew how deeply attached was Eberto to the revolution. Suddenly he was put in prison, and the government accused him of being a CIA agent, and that was, for many friends of the revolution, a scandal. And so we wrote a manifest, which was signed by many writers all over the world. And what was grotesque was that immediately after this manifest, Eberto Padilla sorted from the prison, and in an official ceremony accused us to be all that we had signed this manifest defending him, to be CIA agents, and he confessed himself to be a CIA agent. as in the Stalinist trials of the 30s, and so the same people, with few exceptions, that had signed the first manifesto, wrote a second manifesto cutting the support and the attachment that we had had until then with the Cuban Revolution. I was particularly attacked because of that by Cuba and by the, well, it was mostly the communist writers and intellectuals in Latin America who still defended Cuba, because I had written the second manifest, you know. So suddenly I became, let's say, a CIA agent, you know, for my colleagues all over Latin America, my leftist colleagues. But for me it was very, very important, because I recovered a kind of freedom that I hadn't had the previous years. Although I had reserves with many things that were happening in Cuba, I didn't dare to speak openly about this with the idea, with the chantage, that you must not give weapons to the enemy. Well, since then, after the Padilla affair, I didn't think anymore that I should accept this kind of limitation in the expression or writing of my criticisms about Cuba and about everything. At the same time, you know, I felt very isolated and very confused about myself. I was against Cuban Revolution, I was against communism, the idea of this collectivistic society in which the individual practically disappeared, where total control of cultural, economic policies were in the hand of the state, produced a kind of suffocating, you know, and that I couldn't accept. But with what to replace them? With the despicable democracy? It was very difficult to be a Democrat in Latin America in the 60s if you had imagination and social sensibility. The manifestation of democracy that we have was totally grotesque, where all the dictatorships, the military dictatorships in Latin America, they were so numerous at that time, and the United States was supporting this dictatorship because it considered that the military dictatorships were the bulwark against communism. You know, all the dictators that we despise had been decorated by United States. The General Odría in Peru, Trujillo had been decorated by United States. Somoza has been decorated by United States. Even stronger, the Paraguayan dictator was a very close friend of United States. How to believe in democracy, you know, if democracy was this, and the great democratic country of the world, United States, was supporting in that explicit and scandalous way the dictators. You know. So I felt very isolated, very confused, and it took me, you know, some time to discover that, in spite of these very bad examples, democracy meant something particularly in real democratic countries. And in Europe, there were real democratic countries in which this formal democracy was reducing, exploitation, reducing discrimination, and in which, in spite of all the problems, there was a free information, the right of criticism was respected, and as always in my life, books were very, very important. I was living in Paris, as I told you, and I read people that before, even if I haven't read one word of what they wrote, became very, very important for the new person that I had become after my crisis with Cuba. Raymond Aron, for example. It was very, very important for me to read Raymond Aron, particularly a book of him called El opio de los intelectuales, the opium of the intellectuals. That is Marxism. A fantastic book in which he explained the reason why intellectuals, and sometimes great, very great intellectuals, well, Sartre, for example, a great thinker, had been seduced by Marxism, which was, from a philosophical point of view, so poor and so schematic, and he explained that this kind of social utopia, which was the Marxist ideology, seemed to represent a kind of perfection to which writers, artists were so deeply, deeply attached. And at the same time, why democracy, a system that excludes, since the beginning, the idea of perfection, was so anemical, so less of attraction for writers, for intellectuals who were in search of perfection. And I remember, for example, the importance that had for myself Jean-François Revel. Jean-François Revel, a political essayist, a journalist, a very, very cultivated man with a very serious philosophical training. He had been a socialist in his youth, like myself, and then he had been taking distance with socialism, with communism, with Marxism, and he had become a real Democrat with a liberal kind of inclination. And his books were, for me, very, very important in those years. And I discovered that, well, the idea of democracy to be only a formal mask for the exploitation, for the domination from a minority of a majority was a caricature, a grotesque caricature of the real world, and that even the worst democracies were real paradises compared with the kind of brutal exploitation and brutal control without any kind of tolerance and freedom that were the socialist, communist societies. This was more or less the way in which I became first a Democrat and then a liberal. It's not the same thing. You can be a Democrat and be an enemy of liberalism, and there are many, many cases. But after 8 years living in France, I went to live in England. And in England, I had a fantastic experience, which was the experience of Mrs. Thatcher. I know that there is a brutal caricature of what Mrs. Thatcher represented. But I was there. I lived what happened in Britain during the government of Mrs. Thatcher. And it was not only in intellectual terms, but in practical terms, seeing the transformation of Great Britain, an extraordinary transformation of a country that was little by little, because socialism in economic terms had been becoming more and more passive and mediocre, in which the ideal of the common people seemed to be protected by a growing state, and to have this kind of conformist life that was little by little reducing to a second run, a society that had been at the avant-garde of the great economic, social transformations in the world during the 19th century. The way in which the government of Mrs. Thatcher transformed Britain, resuscitating, the libertarian spirit, opening the country to the world, and launching, this kind of competitive spirit, which transformed completely economically the British society, and the way in which the government, but particularly she, defended, the culture of freedom, the democratic tradition, explaining why are we going to be ashamed vis-à-vis the countries like the Soviet Union, which are a total failure in economic terms, and that have created a kind of dictatorship that has no precedence in history. Are we going to be Democrats to be ashamed of that? To be ashamed vis-à-vis of that? How is possible that in the world now there is this idea that Soviet Union, China, the China of the Cultural Revolution, millions of people sacrificed for a crazy collectivist dream, And the way in which he reivindicated the culture of freedom pushed me to read, people like Hayek, who was an advisor of him. She had, as you probably know, responded an attack in the parliament, a very critical, serious attack on his policies, showing a book by Hayek, and saying, "This is my program of government, Dr. Hayek ideas, Well, I read Hayek, I read Popper. Popper was probably the most important intellectual discovery for myself. I still think that Open Society and Its Enemies is the most important philosophic, political book of the 20th century. I was completely transformed reading and rereading Popper. Isaiah Berlin was also extremely important for myself because he represented something different. He was not an economist. He doesn't speak about economy. But he's a real liberal in the sense of being tolerant, and accept that oneself can be in error. And the idea that it's necessary to be tolerant because the adversary may be right, and we have to accept, the possibility of error in what we believe, in what we are convinced is the truth. And reading Isaiah Berlin, you could see that these were not ideas, that was the spirit that informed everything that he wrote. And he wrote much more about the adversaries of the culture of freedom, of liberalism, as it was also the case of Popper. The Open Society and Its Enemies is a book about the enemies of freedom. And he make Platon, the most important philosopher of his times, the point of departure of this totalitarian tradition, which reaches Marx, Engels, but probably the villain of the Open Society are not Marx or Engels, but Hegel. Hegel is la bestia negra of this book. Well, it is time to stop, but that was more or less, in a very synthetical way, my evolution from the militant of the Kawide, of the Communist Party, to be a very independent and I think I can say, without proud, a confused liberal. What is I'm trying to do today. Thank you very much.